It is February 2nd, 2021. We have a really exciting day ahead of us, and I am so excited to have Mr. Neel Kashkari, who is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and he'll be providing the committee with an overview of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and its key policy initiatives, as well as a presentation on current economic conditions for Minnesota. We did this 2 years ago in a budget year, and I'm very excited to have him back. The Minneapolis Fed covers the 9th Federal Reserve District, which includes Minnesota, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and parts of Wisconsin and Michigan. And he's been the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve since 2016. Welcome and good morning, President Kashkari.
I can hear anything.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. It is great to be with you again. I appreciate the invitation to come back to this committee. I really enjoyed the conversation that we had 2 years ago, and I look forward to hearing questions from you and from the members of the committee. As you said, I'll just start with a brief overview, and then I really look forward to getting into the discussion. Madam Chair, the Federal Reserve is our nation's central bank. It was created by the United States Congress in 1913, and it was created in response to financial crises of the 1800s and the big banking panic of 1907. But Congress did something unique in 1913 when they created the Federal Reserve. They didn't want the central bank simply housed in Washington, D.C. They wanted it spread around the nation's, the whole country, so that all the regions of our country were directly represented in policymaking. So they created 12 independent Federal Reserve banks, the 9th of which is the Minneapolis Fed, as you just indicated. And our jobs at the Minneapolis Fed are literally to represent the people of Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and Northwestern Wisconsin. Our jobs are to know what's happening on the ground in our economy here in our region, and then bring that insight back to Washington, D.C. when we set monetary policy for the nation. Now, we do other things in addition to monetary policy. We do a lot of economic research on the regional economy, the national economy, the global economy. We also supervise banks in our region. We provide cash to, if you go to the ATM and you take out $100, that money would have started out in our vault. So we also provide cash into the banking system so that the people of Minnesota and our neighboring states can get the cash that they need. Now, we do a lot of economic research, as I mentioned, on our economy regionally and nationally. And we also go out and talk to a lot of businesses, a lot of workers, legislators like yourselves, to make sure that we have a sense of what's happening on the ground here in our state to make us smarter when I go back to Washington, D.C. We're doing it virtually right now, but I go back to Washington, D.C. at least every 6 weeks when we have our interest rate meetings. Now, just one quick word, which is probably obvious to your members, but maybe some of your constituents are watching at home, just the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is the job of the state legislature and the federal legislature, where you decide how much you want to tax the people and then what you want to spend those tax revenues on, be it education or healthcare or roads or national defense at the national level. Monetary policy is what we do. What we do is we set interest rates for the economy to try to manage the ups and downs of the U.S. economy. And we call it a dual mandate. The U.S. Congress has given us two goals. One goal is stable prices. Think of an economy that's not overheating, but an economy that's not limping along. And then the other goal is maximum employment. As many Americans and as many Minnesotans as possible are able to find jobs and are gainfully employed. And we manage this. Traditionally, we think about this like a seesaw. If the economy gets really hot and businesses have to compete to find workers, you would see the unemployment rate fall, which is a good thing. But then businesses would have to compete and pay up in terms of wages, and then inflation would climb on the other end. So traditionally, we try to manage these two goals by moving interest rates up and down. If we see that the economy is overheating, we would then raise interest rates, which would make it more expensive for a business to get a loan to go build a new factory, or more expensive for a family to get a mortgage to go buy a house, and that would cool down the economy. In the opposite, if the economy is hitting a rough patch, or the pandemic that hit us last year, we would then cut interest rates to make it cheaper to get that loan for that business or that family, thereby providing more of a boost to the economy. So that's traditionally what our role has been. Now, just very briefly, before the pandemic hit, the Minnesota economy was very strong. The national economy was strong. The national unemployment rate was around 3.5%. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and we went into a very deep, very fast recession. At that point, there was great uncertainty about what this pandemic meant. How deadly was the virus? How contagious was the virus? And everybody pulled back. The Minneapolis Fed, we have about 1,000 employees. We all moved to working from home last March, or 95% of us roughly who can do that. I'm in my basement right now, and I've basically been here for much of the past year. But there was great fear in financial markets. And so investors said, boy, we don't know what the future looks like. We just want to hold cash. And they started shunning securities, be they stocks or bonds or even U.S. Treasury bonds that the U.S. Treasury Department issues. That's when the central bank steps in to provide liquidity into the financial system to get financial markets moving again. We call that our lender of last resort function. When fear seizes the markets and people just want cash, we stand ready to provide cash into the financial system. And let me just give you an example of why that's important. That's important because we knew that this pandemic, it's a healthcare crisis, but we knew it directly affected certain sectors of the economy. Think about the restaurant sector and the travel industry, the service sectors where there's a lot of in-person contact. It was obvious very quickly that those sectors would be dramatically affected by the pandemic. But there was a risk through the financial system that other sectors of the economy would be hit too. So when we all stopped going out to restaurants and I started going to the grocery store more often to buy groceries for my family, well, the companies like General Mills, a great Minnesota company that stocks the shelves in our grocery stores, when companies whose businesses were sound and who we needed to keep running through the pandemic, if they had trouble raising money because the financial markets were under stress, then this healthcare crisis, which affected certain sectors of the economy, would bleed over and affect the rest of the US economy. And that's why the Federal Reserve acted very aggressively last March and last April to make sure the financial markets were functioning so that the blue chip companies whose businesses were sound were able to access the money that they needed so they could continue to operate. And we took very aggressive action in March and April of last year, and our actions were effective in unlocking some of these other financial markets, which I'm happy that it was effective, and it's important that it was. Since then, it's really all been about the virus. When the vaccines would be available, it's really good news that 2 vaccines are now available and people are getting shots in their arms, and that potentially 2 more are on their way. And we just need as many Americans, as many Minnesotans as possible to be vaccinated so that we can have confidence and we can restore much of the economy back to the way it was. There will likely be some lasting changes from this that are hard to predict right now. We can talk about that, but it's really critical right now that the virus is still in charge of the economy. And the sooner we can get the vast majority of Minnesotans and the vast majority of Americans vaccinated, the sooner we'll be able to get back to normal. So that's just a very brief overview. One more comment. We have made progress in Minnesota and nationally in getting people back to work. The headline unemployment rate in America has fallen to 6.7%, and the Minnesota unemployment rate has fallen to 4.4%. But that masks many, many people who have left the labor force because they've given up. And so they're not counted as being unemployed. So if you look nationally, we think by our estimates at the Minneapolis Fed, the true unemployment rate nationally today is around 10%. And that is still as bad as the worst labor market during the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. So we have made some progress. That's good news. But we are a long way away from having restored our economy and restored our labor market, most importantly, and putting Minnesotans and putting Americans back to work. And so we shouldn't declare victory too early would be one of my messages. So thank you, Madam Chair. I would be pleased to take your questions and questions from the committee.
Thank you, President Kashkari. That was excellent. And I know there's going to be some questions. I have just a quick one. That you said you think the unemployment's around 10% right now, and the pre-pandemic level was 3.5%. That's a big jump that we have to somehow manage. And we have talked about the labor force, the retirements, women in the labor force. How does that all intersect, and how do we get people again back out there?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, those numbers are right. So nationally, it was 3.5% before the pandemic. It's officially 6.7% today, but that's undercounting it. The real number is close to 10%. So it's still a terrible labor force. And as you know, it's very unfair how it's been applied, right? It's not been across the board evenly. People like those of us on this call, myself, been able to work from home. We haven't been that affected by this, whereas it's been disproportionately impacting the lower paid workers, the service workers. And by the way, those are the folks who can't work from home. And those are the folks who, even if they were managed to keep their job, they have to go in person to work, whether it's the grocery store checkout person or the person who's working, stocking shelves. So they're also exposed to more healthcare risks from catching the virus and maybe spreading the virus. So it's been a deeply unfair pandemic on many, many dimensions. And I guess I would just say we need to just continue to give support to those people through the unemployment programs, through the small business programs, continue to give support to those Minnesotans who've been directly affected by this pandemic. And then at the national level, the Federal Reserve needs to keep our foot to the floor in providing economic monetary policy stimulus. And hopefully the US Congress will continue to provide support until we can get the pandemic behind us and really restore the economy. Last thing I'll say, Madam Chair, in the last recovery after the financial crisis, it took 10 years to rebuild our labor market and to bring everybody back in and getting them gainfully employed again. We cannot have another 10-year recovery. That is far too long. The cost to society and the cost to families is far too steep. And just as you said, it's disproportionately affecting women, especially when you think about the childcare issues and the burdens falling on the moms who then have to stay home from work. And that hurts their own economic prospects and their own career potential.
Senator Ingebrigtsen and Senator Franzen.
Thank you, Mr. For the great report. I watch the news a lot and try and get a fair idea of what's going on with these checks that are coming from Washington, and certainly they're very well received, especially if you receive one. But I'm wondering overall if you can give us an idea what that has done for the economy. I mean, has that taken the edge off of near disaster? Well, what's your opinion on that? And of course, it has to come from someplace. I don't think they have any special trees in Washington, D.C. that they shake. Everybody always asks me that. Where are you getting your money? Well, we all know that this money is going to have to be paid back. Well, what's your feeling about getting those very helpful checks coming from the federal government?
Well, Madam Chair, Senator, thank you for your question. I think the one-time checks, so I'd carve it into two categories. One is the enhanced unemployment benefits that the U.S. Congress has provided, and those are meant to be targeted to people who've lost their jobs. But as we've analyzed it, even though those are very generous and they're targeted, the U.S. economy is so big and it's so complex, you still miss a lot of people who for whatever reason aren't able to access the unemployment system or don't access it. And so those one-time checks, we actually think complement the unemployment benefits because it's like spraying water. It's like a fire. You're trying to put out the fire. You spray water to make sure you get all the embers. Now, I recognize that one of the criticisms of the checks is it goes to some families who don't need it, right? They kept their jobs. They don't need the one-time check. And I get that, but nobody has figured out a way to really target the people who really need the assistance and make sure you get all of them. So I think the one-time checks complement the unemployment insurance because they're much more widely spread. And the families that get the checks that don't need it, they tend to just pay down debt with it. So it doesn't actually lead to a big boost of inflation. So I do think the checks are important. And another reason they're important is they've helped families pay their bills. It's not really about economic stimulus where you're trying to stimulate the economy. It's more about helping families avoid insolvency so they can pay their car payment or they can pay their credit card bills or they can pay their rent. And that's why if you look at the banking system has actually done fine in this pandemic because Congress has helped families pay their credit card bills, pay their car loans, pay their mortgages. If they weren't able to pay those, you'd see those losses rolling up into the banking system. And then lastly, to your question about the debt, I look at this like wartime spending. The US government has extraordinary capacity to issue debt, to borrow money from Americans and from abroad. People have great confidence, more confidence in the US economy than any other economy in the world. So we have the capacity for this wartime spending to support our fellow Americans until we get this pandemic behind us. That doesn't mean that we can just spend forever and let the debt climb forever and there will never be consequences. But right now, this is like a war. And I believe that we have the capacity to do what we need to get the war, to win the war.
Thank you for your thoughts. Great. Thanks.
President Kashkari, before I go to Senator Franzen, but the savings by the Americans is extremely high, it sounds like. I was just reading that the saving rate is 12.9% in November of 2020, down from a record 33.7% in April, but still well above the 7.5% rate of November, a year ago, November of 2019. So the personal savings have seen a $2 trillion increase. And then credit is incredibly cheap and accessible. I mean, it's all, how does this going to interact? We need to start spending too, don't we, to get this economy going? And
well, Madam Chair, it's a really important observation that you made about the savings rate. So here's what's going on. Those of us that have managed to keep our jobs, we tend to be the higher paid workers anyway. And we're saving more money because we're not going out to restaurants, we're not traveling, we're staying home and we're going to the grocery store. Mm-hmm. So we're all saving more money. So we're actually, economically speaking, better off. What's happening? That money we're putting in the bank, and that money then becomes available the way the US economy works and the financial system works. That actually flows back into the bond market, and that actually makes it easier for the US government to then borrow. So in a sense, the extra money that we're saving is in a way financing the extra deficits that the US government is funding to support our fellow Americans who got the short end of the stick and the ones that are really being hammered by this pandemic. But you're right, once we get to this once the vaccines are widely available and we all feel safe and we start going back to normal, the fact that we have more money saved up should make it easier for us to have a stronger economic recovery, because now we can take those trips. Now we can go back out to the restaurant that we've missed, and that should provide somewhat of a tailwind once we get the pandemic behind us.
Thank you. Senator Franson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Kashkari, thank you for being here. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to piggyback first from Senator Ingebrigtsen's question about the stimulus at the federal level. The debate is obviously very politicized right now in Congress. I love your thoughts about the size of those checks. What difference does it make if it's a $600 check, a $1,400 check, or a $2,000 check with regard to the economy? Just your honest, non-political opinion on what would be, and I know it's a hard question because we don't know all the unintended consequences of this, to the point of some people who get those checks who don't necessarily need them and maybe save them or maybe spend them on things that are not rent and basic necessities. So that's my piggyback question off of Senator Ingebrigtsen. But my other concern is all of us are under extreme pressure to reopen the economy. Schools is a particular of concern to me. That is a huge issue, obviously, all over the state. But when it comes to how do we support those workers, you talked about moms. A lot of us on this call are some of those moms who are doing virtual learning. And the productivity level, let's be frank, is not the greatest, right? So that is another factor. I'm not sure if the Fed is monitoring the productivity, not just of women, but of workers, because husbands are still at home too, working with kids at home. How does that factor in? And how do we, I know the timing, you're not the scientist here, and I'm not asking you to give us scientific advice, but from an economy standpoint, where is the breaking point, or what can you see? How can we survive this real uncertain time where the pandemic can kick back up in numbers in our hospitals? And how do we prepare for that next spike from an economy standpoint, not opening too soon? Have you guys given that thought and modeling, and what can you help us understand from an economic standpoint so we make those decisions of supporting our teachers? One of the things that I've actually pushed for with some of my colleagues is that teachers get the vaccine first, childcare workers get the vaccine. We don't have enough to do everybody at the same time, but if we want the economy to go back to work, people need to at least be focused on working without having a school in their basement. And that is just the reality of what we're all living, and we're dealing with it. But there's a lot of strain. It's been a year, and it's going to be longer. So can you give us some insight on that? So sorry, two big questions. Thank you.
President Kashkari.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator, for your questions. First, on the size of the checks, I don't have an economic analysis to say what is the right number, because when I look at it, what is the purpose of the checks? To me, the purpose of the check is to reach those people who, for whatever reason, who should be collecting unemployment insurance, who should qualify, but for whatever reason don't. And the research is very clear that it tends to be lower income workers, less skilled workers who, for whatever reason, aren't able to collect unemployment benefits. And so you want to give them some support. Now, of course, if somebody has lost their job for 6 months or a year, I mean, what's $600 going to do for them? I mean, it's going to help. It's better than nothing, but it's not going to be that much help if they have to pay rent and they have to put food on the table. So in that sense, you'd want to go bigger, because you want to get those people assistance to bridge them over for a longer period of time. But then the pushback is, well, it's a very blunt instrument, and you're going to send this money to a bunch of people who already are collecting unemployment benefits or who didn't lose their job. And so I wish I could give you an answer, Senator, on what I think is the right number. I think that is really, unfortunately, a political judgment call. And I don't mean partisan politics. I just mean it's a call for legislators to use their judgment on what they feel right. But it's related to your next question, which is, how long is this pandemic going to be with us? I talk to a lot of health experts. I know you all do. Just as you said in your question, there have been flare-ups. Right now, we've got this UK strain, B117, that is kind of spread across America already. We don't know how much it's there, but we know it's there. And the health experts I consult with think the next few months are going to be really rough, that we're seeing it tip down in the pandemic now, but they expect it to flare back up again because this new strain is so much more contagious than the baseline COVID strain. And how do we prepare for that? How do we adjust for that? And how do we get through this? I mean, to me, everything you said, whether it's moms that are affected by this. And I'll tell you, I mean, my wife and I have two very young children. My wife lost her job last March. She worked in the travel industry. So, I mean, it is affecting people, and I know it firsthand from my own household. And the burdens of, what kind of education are kids getting sitting in front of a computer? I mean, the need to reopen schools. I mean, I could not agree more strongly with you. And we also need it to be safe for our teachers and for the kids and for the people working there. So these are really complicated issues. All I can say is I think we're all learning as we're going. I think the health experts are learning more as we're going. We know that, like they've told me, that they know that transmission is much more through our breathing than it is touching doorknobs, right? So they're learning, we're getting smarter about this. But the only thing we can do is get as many people vaccinated as possible. Get the teachers vaccinated, get the folks working in grocery stores vaccinated. Nobody's still going to get the disease, but that's all we can practically do. So my advice to you, my humble advice to you, can do to help get Minnesotans vaccinated as quickly as possible, get more vaccine in the state, make sure those vaccines are accessible and are equitably distributed, and then provide as much support as you can to the families and to the workers and the small businesses that are still impacted. One last thing, it's a long answer, but it was a complicated question. When are we going to achieve herd immunity? That's the thing that everybody's looking for. The CEO of Moderna, one of the vaccine manufacturers, recently said he thinks we're going to have to live with some form of COVID for the foreseeable future because the virus is going to continue to mutate. And so what does the economy look like a year from now? There probably are going to be permanent changes that we're not quite sure what they are. Doesn't mean we're going to be in lockdown for another year, but it's not going to look exactly like it looked in the beginning of 2019. And what do those adjustments look like, and what help do people need to get there? I can't tell you right now, unfortunately.
Thank you. Senator Kent.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Kashkari, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being here and for this really, I think, very thoughtful and obviously important discussion. Real quickly, just to your point, before I get to my real question about the vaccine and the mutations and the effects on the long run, one of the things we're hearing is the better we can control the spread, the more likely we're able to eliminate a lot of these variants. And so, this just goes to the mitigation efforts we can do. Obviously, it's an important balancing act with making sure that we're supporting our businesses as best as possible through this. But, wearing masks is the kind of activity that allows businesses to stay open and can help control the spread. And so I just think that's something we all need to take a leadership role on here. But back to my original question, I really appreciated your comments about the effects in our population of the unemployment, the recognition that for women, that women have disproportionately experienced these losses, and the effects. I think it is so important that you acknowledge that's going to have on their long-term earnings and financial security. And that is also true for people of color in a lot of the same studies. We know that. So it is hugely important that we recognize that. You were talking about the stimulus effect of what's been going on recently, and you and Senator Franzen had a good conversation about the size of the individual checks, which definitely matters to the individual people. But from a macro perspective, the importance of the stimulus on the overall economy. I know that after the Congress passed the bill in December, the conversation has been that, we don't exactly know what the projections are going to be by the economists from that impact, but we believe it will have a positive, it'll be reflected positively in our February forecast, for example. But what it made me think about, and again, in the context of the conversation that everyone is having at the federal level, I read something from an economist, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. We all know time has no meaning anymore, but basically saying that when we're having these conversations about stimulus, that there is the risk of doing the risk of doing too little outweighs the risk of doing too much. And to your point about how long the recovery took coming out of the Great Recession of 2008 and on, that it was a 10-year recovery and how slow that was. There's been a lot, I believe, I would say consensus, and this gets to my question to you, that if we had had a more ambitious stimulus at that time, the recovery would have been quicker, that we would have bounced back more quickly. And, to the degree that we can learn from history, I'm just wondering if, from your perspective, if you think that is a fair assessment of how things happened 12 years ago, and what that means for what we should be doing right now to make sure that we're putting ourselves in a position to recover quickly and strongly from this situation.
President Kashkari.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator, for your question. Yes, I do think the consensus is now that the last recovery was as slow as it was, in part because the fiscal policymakers were not as aggressive as they could have been or should have been. And by the way, some of it's on the Federal Reserve. We also were not as aggressive in that recovery as I argued that we should have been at the time, at the tail end of that recovery. And I think we've certainly learned that lesson. One of the big surprises, a positive surprise, is that many people, the vast majority of people want to work. So in the last recovery, the economics profession said, well, there's this big group of people and they've been unemployed for a year or two, they're gone. You're never going to bring them back in the job market. And that was conventional wisdom. So we thought, well, the economy's potential is lower because they've left the job market for good. Well, it turned out in the last few years before the pandemic hit, as the economy continued to strengthen, as the labor market tightened, as wages started going up, especially for low-wage workers, folks started coming in off the sidelines. And we were really surprised. Either they came off the sidelines or older Americans said, you know what, I'm not going to retire. I'm going to work for a few more years because I'm actually making pretty good money right now and I enjoy working. So it turned out that the economy's potential was much bigger than we expected and that we realized. And that was great news. I mean, it should be in everybody's interest, regardless of political party, to create an opportunity for as many Americans as possible to work and to contribute, to provide for themselves and their families and contribute to our economy. And we saw that before the pandemic hit. And so I think we've all learned that lesson, and I hope we will all be aggressive to rebuild that labor market and put people back to work so that they don't need the assistance of unemployment benefits or other support.
Senator King.
Thank you.
Okay. Senator Johnson. Senator Johnson. There you go.
How about that?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Kashkari, thank you for coming today. We were talking a little bit about the past recession back in 2008 and 9. Back then, even though it was a limited stimulus, the TARP program was a $1 trillion deal, and we had many programs going into that. I think Chairman Bernanke was talking about throwing cash from helicopters at the time to get the economy going. So I think there was an appetite for it, but we still have to balance, long-term interests. One of the things that I'm very concerned about right now is with the amount of cash that's out there, are we seeing some inflationary effects, number one? And then number two, with the stock market right now in its present form, it seems like they're soaking up a lot of the cash that is going out and maybe working its way up to unrealistic valuations, in which we saw maybe last week. Just wondering what your thoughts are on those two items.
President Kashkari.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for your question, Senator. On inflation, so we have a goal of trying to hit 2% inflation a year, and most central banks around the world have a similar goal. One of the perplexing things for us is that over the past 10 years, even before the pandemic, we kept coming up short at around 1.5% inflation. And it's actually been a challenge for central banks to actually achieve their 2% inflation target. And so we're not seeing, right now, inflation has fallen because the economy is running below potential right now. So many people are out of work. Inflation is running much below where it was before the pandemic. It's something we watch very, very carefully and how to have a lot of different measures of inflation to make sure we're getting a complete picture. So we're not seeing inflation now. And we have readings of people's expectations of future inflation. So it turns out if we all believe that high inflation is coming, it tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then we go to our employer and say, hey, I need a raise because prices are going up. and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So one of the things that economists pay a lot of attention to are people's expectations of future inflation. And we can read that by surveying people, and we can also read that by some pretty complicated financial market measurements. So we're not seeing signs of high inflation now or even in the future. In terms of the stock market, certainly people say, well, boy, the Fed is being aggressive, and look, the stock market is high. There must be a connection. It's unclear that there's a direct connection, but even if there is, and the stock market were to fall back down and have a correction, so to speak, I would still argue that it's better that we use our tools to recover the economy and to put people back to work. Because if we tried to raise interest rates to put a lid on the stock market, that's a very blunt instrument. So imagine if we said, well, we're nervous about the stock market, so we're going to raise interest rates to keep it in check. The cost of keeping that in check would be keeping more Americans unemployed and keeping their wages lower. And so to me, that's not a very good trade-off, but it is something we pay a lot of attention to financial markets. We're always looking for things that could lead to a crisis. And I don't think that if the stock market were to fall somewhat, if there's a correction, that leads to a crisis. I think that that's a loss for investors, and so be it. But we have to pay attention, in my view, what could lead to an actual crisis. And the last thing I'll just say, when the tech bubble burst in 2000, that was a heck of a correction, as you recall. That led to a very mild recession. That didn't lead to a full-blown economic crisis. So my view is the stock market goes up and down. It's going to do what it's going to do. We need to focus on the real economy, putting people back to work, making sure inflation is where we want it to be. And that's what we're trying to do now.
Senator Johnson, good. Senator Champion.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to ask Mr. Kashkari a question, and welcome to the committee, Mr. Kashkari. I know earlier that you talked about the difference between fiscal policy and the monitoring and how the Fed set the interest rates. And you talked a lot about savings and jobs and all the other stuff, all the things that are important. But I like to contextualize this. I know that when the coronavirus struck the U.S. in early spring, that lots of things went crazy. The stock market went into free fall, mortgage rates plummeted as well, and thousands of homeowners rushed in to refinance their loans, getting much needed savings on their mortgage payments, which is important because I heard you talk about that earlier today. But one of the things that was disturbing to me, I read an article today that says Blacks are being denied mortgage refinance as on an average of 30.22%, far more than whites. And so my question to you is, if that is true, can you tell me what we can do to help banks get over consistent discrimination that we see for people of color, especially in light of the fact that we have the lowest interest rate, and that impacts their ability to survive and to plan and to generate wealth going forward? And even though we had this challenge even before the pandemic, I think the pandemic continues to elevate disparities when we think in terms of health, and we are seeing it also when we think in terms of wealth. So I hope you understand my question, and thank you for taking the time to take a stab at it.
President Kashkari.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator Champion. One of our roles in regulating banks is making sure that they are providing access to credit fairly in the communities that they serve. And so I'll give you just a very specific thing. If you have examples of constituents that come to you and say, hey, I should have qualified for this refinance and I was denied and it's not fair, send them to us, call us, and we will have our bank examiners look at it and try to get to the bottom of it. That's the most tangible thing I can tell you. We take this very seriously, and we want to hold banks accountable to make sure that they're treating their customers, regardless of race or regardless of color, regardless of religion. We want to make sure that they're treating all of their customers fairly, and we'll use whatever tools we have available to do that. And so that's the most tangible thing I could ask you to do, if I may, Senator. And I can commit to you, we will follow up.
Senator Champion.
And thank you for that. And the last thing that I'll say is a part of the reading that I've done has been centered around the fact that when banks ask for race data, not just the financial data, that those were the situations where they were denied. And then once they took the race data off, then they received the loan or the refinancing. But I'll certainly do my part, and I hope that you will look into this as a systems issue and see what are some of the things that are happening that continues to plague or undermine people of color's ability to generate wealth and build wealth and have every fair opportunity like any of our white colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've enjoyed the discussion on the macro level on what's happening, but I'm thinking about maybe a little bit closer to home. We don't have the ability to deficit spend like the federal government does. Any thoughts on what you're seeing as far as strategies to bring people back to work, to lower the unemployment rate, raise the labor participation rate? Because what we're hearing anecdotally from employers is that they've got help wanted signs out, they can't find people. So it feels like we're in a little bit of a conundrum here. How do we, any thoughts on what states are doing well to spur investment at this time when rates are low? Just some general thoughts as local policymakers.
Yeah, that's a great question too, Senator Pratt, because there is a difference between what's going on in greater Minnesota and the metro too, as far as unemployment and what that looks like. Also, Center for Rural Policy and Development just put out a piece on that. But President Kashkari.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator Pratt. I hear those anecdotes too. Whether it's directly the businesses that I chat with or elected representatives who hear that from their constituents, both state representatives and federal representatives. But if you look at the aggregate data, there's no question that there are far more people who are out of work than there are businesses that are looking to hire. And I got to tell you that even before the pandemic, I had started to grow very skeptical of the businesses' complaints that they couldn't find workers. I mean, I know at some level it has to be true, right? Because our demographics are what they are. We're not having kids as fast. Our labor force is not growing. So at a national level, it has to be true. But businesses are used to finding workers readily available at wages they're used to paying. And what interesting thing happened for the last 3 or 4 years before the pandemic. Businesses kept saying, we can't find workers. It's a worker shortage. And then I would always ask them, well, are you paying more? No. Well, why don't you pay more? And then they'd be able to find the workers. And so there's something very emotional for businesses about workers. Here's what I mean. If the price of steel goes up and a business needs to buy steel for their business, they shrug their shoulders. They're not happy about it, but the price of steel went up. So be it. But if they can't find workers at yesterday's wages, oh my gosh, it's a worker shortage. There's just no workers out there, instead of actually just paying up. And so I've kind of lost my sympathy, because business has been making these arguments for so many years, to argue right now when the real national unemployment rate is 10%, they're saying they can't find workers. Maybe you ought to try a little bit harder, would be my message to them. I know this is not a message they're going to like to hear. I'll give you one more quick anecdote. I was in North Dakota a few years ago, and I did a town hall or a roundtable with small businesses. And they were telling me it's this historic worker shortage. It's absolutely impossible to find workers. So I asked them, I said, tell me a time when there was a good labor market, when you could find workers available. And they thought about it, and they said, 2009 was a good labor market. Of course, we were in a terrible recession in 2009. So again, I'm just saying that I've lost my sympathy when business says they can't find workers. Usually it's because they're not trying very hard.
Senator Pratt.
So thank you, Madam Chair. So then to the other part of the question, what are you seeing that's being successful in other states to spur employment growth and investment growth?
President Cash.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator, thank you for the second part of the question. It's very sector specific. Some sectors are doing great. You've heard about the K-shaped recovery. Some sectors have fully recovered and gone on to new heights. Other sectors that are in-person, retail, service-oriented are still being hammered by the pandemic. And so I don't think anybody has figured out how to take those other sectors, the ones that are really exposed, and nobody's figured out a great solution on how to reopen those. You know, the previous senator made a comment about masks. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about the NFL, how the National Football League managed to have their season. They had some flare-ups, but they by and large managed to save their season by, you know, very aggressive testing, very aggressive contact tracing, and masks. And one of the things that the NFL figured out was that even the briefest contact between two people unmasked indoors in a low ceiling is a big vulnerability to spreading COVID. And so I guess some businesses lend themselves to wearing masks. You know, you go to a restaurant, how do you eat wearing a mask? You can't eat wearing a mask. So I wish I had a better answer for you, Senator. I think it's very sector specific. And for those sectors that are just naturally exposed and risky relative to transmission, there's no substitute for getting people vaccinated.
Senator Franson.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Kashkari. I think I was kind of on the lines of Senator Pratt, so this is a good timing for a question regarding to workforce, because just yesterday in the news, they were talking about that we will not get to pre-pandemic levels until 2024 in terms of workforce. That's nationally, that's not talking about Minnesota. You obviously oversee Minnesota. What can we do in the state, to Senator Pratt's point, to stimulate our local economy? We have great companies. We want them to continue to hire and be able to excel. A lot of people obviously working from home, but what levers are the most appropriate? And maybe there's a lot of them, but maybe there's one that we can get a bigger bang for our buck, whether it's putting more money in K-12 education, in childcare, in investments in employment training for specific industries like technology, because we know that's what's kind of, you know, the trend of technology, especially in the pandemic. We've learned so much we can do, or other areas in technology for investments. We've had programs before that we put money aside for those type of trainings, whether it's trades. Is there some light, and maybe you can come back to us and help us prioritize, or help us give us an economic data point where we can say, this is what's really needed. Our kids are going to be falling behind. Put money in summer school, put money in higher ed, because those kids have been probably impacted the most because they've been isolated. Put money in sports, whatever that is. We have levers too. We have a surplus, and we have taxpayer dollars that we want to put in good use in a very critical time for us to come out of it stronger. Any thoughts about our own budget and what we can do, putting aside the transfers we'll get from the federal government? Where can we put the biggest bang for our buck? I'm biased on this question, but I'd love your thoughts.
President Kashkari.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator. A few things come to mind, top of mind. One, you talked about childcare. You know, a lot of childcare providers are home-based, and rebuilding that sector of the economy so that provides work for those folks who are working in that childcare center, whether it's home-based or a more formal center. But it also then enables other people to go to work if they can have affordable childcare. So I think there are things that you could do at the state level, both through funding, but I think also through policy to help jumpstart rebuilding the childcare sector in Minnesota. And by the way, I already know Minnesota, the legislature has done a lot to support the childcare industry in Minnesota, more than most states have done. So I would continue to say that that's an important effort going forward. That's one. Another topic that has not yet come up today, which is enormously important at the federal level and the state level, is the availability of broadband across the state of Minnesota and across the country. I mean, we knew that was important before the pandemic hit, but boy, we sure know how important it is now. And anything you can do at the state level, perhaps working in partnership with your federal colleagues to make sure all Minnesotans have access to broadband, that helps telemedicine, that helps learning, that helps job creation. There's so many benefits from making sure that all Minnesotans have access to broadband. And that's another thing that I think that you are in a position to directly influence. So those would be two things that jump out. I guess the third thing I'll say, and this is, you talk to businesses all the time. Again, go back to before the pandemic hit. For years, businesses have been saying, we can't find workers, it's impossible, worker shortage. So then they started doing a couple things. They started paying more, which drew people off the sidelines, and they started training them themselves. They used to say, I've got a machine and I want to find a worker who already knows how to use my machine and will make X dollars an hour. Well, I can't find that worker because there's scarcity. So now I'm going to pay a little more. And you know what? I'll train you. Businesses started going to further lengths to invest in their workers because it was in their own interest. So I guess I would say to you and your colleagues respectfully, get that message out to business. I mean, don't sit around and wait and say, well, somebody's got to solve my worker shortage for me. They actually have very powerful tools to get people off the sidelines, to bring them in, to train them, and to make them productive members. If businesses adopted the practices they adopted, if they adopted them in 2018 and 2019, if they had adopted them in 2015 and 2016, we would have rebuilt the labor force more quickly. And so I also think part of it is just getting that message out in the role that business needs to play.
Senator Franzen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Kashkari, thank you for that question. Thank you for bringing up broadband, because that was kind of encompassing my thought about technology. But to the point that Chair Rosen mentioned earlier, this would help the entire state. You can work from anywhere. And once our kids are back on track in terms of maybe normal school, people are going to choose to work from home, and companies are going to allow that because this pandemic has really shown that it can be done. So I agree with you 100%. We have a good chunk of money coming to the state from the federal government, but we have to make sure that it's done equitably across our state, and that the little small towns can have and attract workers from all these great companies that are usually based more in the metro and suburban areas. But certainly we have great companies all around our state. So I agree with that, and I would support that 100%. Thank you for your thoughts.
And, thank you for bringing that up, President Kashkari and Senator Franzen, that broadband is, and we talked about that earlier, President Kashkari, but there is underserved in the metro too, that we need to absolutely target. What is your opinion of what is our workplace going to look like in the future? Are you studying that right now as far as the reserve? What's this landscape going to look like for us?
Well, Madam Chair, it's a great question. We're thinking about it a lot. We're thinking about it a lot for our own employees. We have 1,100 employees, 60 or 70 have to work in the bank every day. The rest of us are working remotely. We've been able to keep up our operations even though we're working remotely. I mean, I do think personally something is lost when everybody's remote and you're not, in person together. I do think that there's a human element that is important, but might our bank look different going forward? It's certainly possible. And so I don't have any great insight into what it's going to look like. I do think part of the question is going to be answered by, do we actually put COVID behind us, or are we going to be in a new posture where we have to learn to live with it? And I'll give you an example. If 70% of the employees of my bank take the vaccine, what happens with the other 30%? And can I bring the other 30% back in the bank? And what kind of safety is there going to be? And are there health risks? Are there liability issues? There are a lot of complicated things to be worked out that I think are going to shape what that new future looks like.
Mm-hmm. We're grappling with that here at the Capitol too. And we talked a little bit, how are we going to set a budget through Zoom? Virtually impossible, I would think. We're going to have to figure this out fairly soon. Senator Benson.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Dr. Kashkari. A couple of things. I heard Senator Pratt talk about employers who can't find people, and your suggestion that they need to pay more, but also that employers need to work on training their employees. Exactly how much are employers supposed to do? I guess, and I don't mean to be flippant at all, but they pay property taxes, they pay income taxes. Minnesota has some of the highest state contributions to education, and people are still either not graduating or they are not literate in some basic ways, some basic executive function. And I don't mean CEO function. I mean, show up for work, know how to write a complete sentence, put your phone down and be able to work for 8 hours. An employer can take someone who's willing to show up, who has basic communication skills, and pay for their training to be a welder, a machinist. They can help them learn to function in some of our medical device industry, operating in clean rooms to assemble medical devices that change the world. But exactly how much are they supposed to be willing to invest in people who didn't graduate, didn't learn to read, don't show up on time? And so there's part of an employment gap that has some more fundamental things than just training and a willingness for an employer to do their part.
President Kashkari.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator, for your question. I agree completely with the spirit of your question. You're absolutely right. That's actually the conversation that I have with employers to say, look, we can train somebody if we have confidence that they're going to show up every day at 8 o'clock and work, an 8-hour day, and they're reliable and they've got the basic communication skills and the basic executive presence skills, just the basic functioning that you talked about. So you're absolutely right. And that's where I think, and I'm glad you raised this, we've done a lot of work at the Minneapolis Fed on education, whether it's early childhood education, which the Minneapolis Fed has been a champion of for a couple decades now, or more recently, our work in K through 12. I do think it is absolutely paramount that Minnesota addresses the terrible education outcomes that so many Minnesota kids are getting, because it's not reasonable and it's not going to happen to say, well, employers need to teach you how to read, right? That's not reasonable. We need to make sure that all Minnesota children are graduating with the skills necessary to contribute to our society and our economy and our democracy. And that's why former Supreme Court Justice Alan Page and I have proposed amending the Minnesota Constitution to create a civil right for every child to get a quality public education. And then very importantly, making it the highest priority of the state to make sure that that actually happens. I had my staff, people in Minnesota care about education. People in the Minnesota legislature care about education. But my humble opinion is politics seems to be getting in the way. I had my staff look at the last 15 years, how many education bills in Minnesota have become law. And by our analysis, it's 122 education bills have become law in Minnesota. So there's a lot of interest in education at the legislature. People are they care about each other, they care about kids. But if you look at the results, we've had zero progress in closing disparities, socioeconomic disparities, racial disparities. And so that just means thousands of Minnesota kids are being left behind. And that's terrible for them, for their families, for our economy, and for our society. And that's why we think we need to do something fundamentally different. And by using the civil right, creating a civil right, we think we can drive transformational change so that we can lift up all these kids and then have them be great contributors to our economy in any number of ways. And so anyway, thank you for allowing me to mention that. And I hope that was responsive to your question, Senator.
Senator Benson.
Thank you. And Dr. Kashkari, you and I haven't had a chance to meet, but I do have a great interest in changing Minnesota's education system so that children can achieve their full potential. I've had that interest since I became a mom, approaching 23 years ago now. We need an education system that is focused on the kids and outcomes and less on structures and institutions. And then I think we solve some of the employment problem. But until we stop having conversations about structures and institutions and focus more on the potential of our children, I think we're going to continue to stagnate. And once we get kids struggling and striving and getting to accomplish what is possible for them, employers will have what they need, and we'll actually have more entrepreneurs, and we will have a more growing economy. Right now, there are way too many people who are on the sidelines.
Madam Chair, could I follow up, please?
Yeah, absolutely, President Kashkari.
Thank you, Senator Benson. I mean, everything you just said, I could not agree more, feel more strongly about. You're absolutely right. And you think about Minnesota's future. Again, right now, my comments about, well, employers just need to work harder to get workers because there's so many people unemployed today. But if you look through the pandemic and think about once we put everybody back to work, where's our workforce of the future going to come from? I mean, we are people constrained. And if we just say, well, we're going to ignore this huge group of poor kids in Minnesota and kids of color in Minnesota and let them fall aside. I mean, not only is it shameful for them and what we're doing to them, but all we're doing is holding back our economy. And so it's in everybody's interest to make sure that all Minnesota kids can realize their full potential. It's morally the right thing to do, but it's economically the right thing to do. And so, I'd love to follow up with you on this topic. It's something I feel very passionate about. And I just think it's of paramount importance to the future of our state.
Thank you. Senator Marty.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Dr. Kashkari. I wanted to follow up with the other end of education when students are entering the workforce and the fact that a whole lot of them have huge debt from higher education, something our generations, earlier generations didn't have that problem with. And they basically have a mortgage on a house, but no house. They just have an education that may help them to do that. And I guess the question is, one, how do we deal with that? And two, it's not just, when I think of the young college graduates who are ready to try something new, to try something, they have two issues. One is the student debt, which is very tough to get out of, and two is healthcare costs. They gotta have healthcare. And so they may not be able to try their entrepreneurial interests. They may not be able to try the job that serves them best, but they have to look for something that can pay enough to pay off the student debts and gives them healthcare benefits. Do you have any suggestions or comments, I guess, generally about people entering the workforce with that kind of problem?
Kashkari.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, Senator, it's a huge issue. There's no question about it. I'm glad that you've raised it. We know in our knowledge-based economy that education is only becoming more and more important. It's never going to become less important. It's only going to become more important. So we need more and more of our young people to have access to more education, whether it's a community college for a couple of years, maybe to become a welder, or going to a traditional four-year college, or going to graduate school. That's only going to be more important in the future. So we need to find a way of educating more people, and it can't just be raising the price and having students take on more and more and more debt. If you take the same system and you push in more volume through it, the costs are going to just go up, And so how do we come up with a model of educating people that is actually scalable, that doesn't simply say kids have to take on more and more debt? So I guess I don't have a clean answer for you other than to say we really need to take a fresh look at our model for higher education. I mean, one of the things, so we force all these kids to go online. And we've heard all these terrible stories, especially for young kids. Let's just be honest, it doesn't work. What are you going to do? You're going to put a 6-year-old in front of Zoom for 8 hours a day? I don't know anybody who thinks that works. But online is working for quite a few college students. Not for every student, not for every class. You can't do online for certain lab classes in chemistry, for example. But online is showing more potential, I think, for college. So I think the only answer is going to be we need to look at fundamental new ways of delivering education that don't simply amount to us having spiraling costs that just lead to more and more debt. That's probably not a very satisfying answer, but that's the most honest answer I can give, because this problem is only going to become bigger.
Senator Marty.
Thanks, that's all.
Thank you. Senator Ken.
Thank you, Madam President. President Kashkari, I really appreciate this conversation. Education for me is paramount. I come from a long family of educators, and that's why I ran for office in the first place. So when we have this conversation, I think it's so important to talk about it. First of all, we all know that the disparities and the opportunity gap in Minnesota is completely unacceptable, and we need to keep doing the work to remedy that. It's one of our most urgent imperatives. It's about what is right for our kids, and it's about what is smart for our workforce and our collective economic future as a state. But I also think when you look at these issues of disparities, you can't say that it's just up to the schools to solve that problem, because the disparities exist outside of the educational sphere. So when you look at the amount of students who are dealing with homelessness or highly mobile situations with great instability, that's a factor. The disparities around healthcare. Our former colleague Alice Johnson was a fighter to make sure that every kid got a vision screening, because there's such a direct link between the ability of kids to be able to see and learn, and not every kid has access to that resource. So there's a whole list, and poverty and many other things that go into this, that, yes, we need our schools working at the top of their game, but there's no way they're going to be able to solve everything. I think it's interesting. You were talking about all the bills, and that we bring up, and believe me, I've heard a lot of bills in my time in the state Senate about education. I will say one thing that I think is important. This was framed in a way this year that I've never heard it before. In our budget, we don't factor in inflation for expenditures in education. We don't have built-in inflationary increases. So we have to have that legislative conversation every 2 years about how much of inflation are we going to fund within our budget. And that takes away our ability, frankly, because that's a big conversation. There's a lot of energy spent trying to figure out how much of inflation we're going to spend to educate our kids every 2 years. So that leaves less time to talk about some of these important policy opportunities that we could be focusing on. So I throw that out as something for people to think about. But also within there, we know that there are things that are working and we can do more of. Full service community schools, for example, have shown great promise, tremendous results. But we need to be able to do more. And they also are there to help address some of the non-academic challenges that our kids are facing. Trying to get more teachers of color into our classrooms. That is a long-standing challenge. I am so grateful, for Governor Walz's work with a number of stakeholders within education to really start trying to address some of these problems. So this is hugely important. But I just think it needs to be said that, yes, our schools have to be the best. But we also have to recognize that they cannot solve all the problems that our kids are facing.
Thank you, Senator Kent. And Senator...
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, may I?
I'm sorry. President Kashkari, yes, please.
Thank you. Senator, thank you for those comments. I agree with you. Schools cannot do everything. The economic environment, the neighborhood, there are all these other factors, socioeconomic factors, that are really important too. I couldn't agree more. But I would also say, we don't just look at what Minnesota is doing. We look at what the country is doing and what other states are doing. And there are states that have made real progress, and they have poverty too. I'll give you an example. And this is remarkable. In the late 90s, Minnesota and Florida were roughly equal in terms of education disparities, racial disparities. In the mid 30s, by some measures, out of 50 states. Florida amended their constitution to create a civil right for a high quality education. And then the governor and the legislature came together and passed sweeping reforms. They shrunk the class sizes, they invested more money, they invested in teacher training, they did a whole bunch of different things. 20 years later, this is not 100 years, 20 years later, Minnesota is exactly where we were in the late 90s, in the mid 30s by this measure, and Florida is 6. They climbed almost 30 spots in 20 years. And so I would just humbly say it is doable. And the most powerful tool we have to break the cycle of poverty is actually education. And the more young kids that we can get a quality education, the easier it is to solve poverty, to solve healthcare, to solve all these other things that we all agree are so important. Thank you.
Senator Kashkari.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Kashkari, for being here today. A good, robust discussion and many points of which I can agree. Probably after having served on Education Committee for a couple of years, I became really strongly aware that probably of all the things we can do, making sure that children in school read by 3rd grade at 3rd grade level is the single most predictor of the future. And so reading by 3rd grade, I just think it seems to make so much common sense that if everybody was focused on meeting that goal, by the time you pass a constitutional amendment, you do some of those things. That is a long-term kind of structure that I'm not sure will accomplish what the goals are. However, reading by third grade at third grade level is something that can be focused on. And I think that the other thing is to take a look at those school districts that are succeeding in having a high measure of good results. What are they doing? What's different about them? What are they doing that enables them in this current educational structure, in this current scenario, are being successful? And not only that, 3 of them are in my Senate district. And in this case, they are the lowest. They're right on the bottom of the per pupil, the amount of money that they get, very bottom. Yet they are at the very top as far as graduation, results, and other things as well. What is happening? What is happening in those school districts? And one of them is the 9th largest in the state of Minnesota. A couple of the others are a little bit smaller in regards to that, but they all are succeeding in the results for their children. This whole pandemic thing, set that aside. We'll see what the results are when we look at that. But I think studying those districts that do, and what is their key to success? I visited a school in North Minneapolis and talked to the principal there. It was a very large minority population. I was the exception in the room, but it was a very industrious school. And talked to the principal there, and he told me some of the good things and the results that they were having. Our standouts, they were succeeding in the midst of an area that others were not. Study those who succeed and see what is it that they do differently. It was interesting. He was the oldest of 14 children, as I am. And so we had a great conversation, but he said, I think it's a situation when you're the oldest in the family, no excuses. Your parents said no excuses. This is what needs to be done. And he said, I work with my principals, my teachers, parents, and students and say, this is the money we have. This is the time we have. Let's go together and work to do our best. And they were having a very good measure of success. Study those, no matter where they are, what are they doing that is ending up with some good results. But for these kids, this year they're in third grade. If they're not reading by third grade level, the statistics are not good for their future. We can do something about them right now, today, in being focused on that particular area. At least stop the pipe of failure. That's what so bothers me. The kids, yes, last year, the kids this year, the pipeline that is already there and is in play is really sad. I just really feel for those kids. And by the way, I grew up in a very poor family, jamming some butter in the refrigerator and cold running water, no septic, no hot running water. Poverty does not mean you cannot succeed. Poverty just means you need to work. And my folks, let me tell you, when I got home from school, or any of us kids, you were expected to pay attention, to behave, and do your homework. And with 14, I assure you, there wasn't an even result in all of that. But there was no question. We all knew and we all understood our responsibility. We can't be everything in the education system, and I don't think we should make them. I think they are responsible for the education. They are responsible in regards to these different things that are happening. And so I would hope we could focus on something that's also more immediate, and that we would find some success by studying those who are having good results. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kiffmeyer. President Kashkari.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Senator, for those comments. I agree completely. There are wonderful things happening across Minnesota that we need to learn from. The challenge is, how do we sustain the effort? So to me, it's not do we study the success stories or do we amend the Constitution? To me, it's we do both. The point of amending the Constitution is it is the people of Minnesota declaring that our highest value is educating our kids, and we want to make sure that we're doing a great job for all of our kids for the foreseeable future. The U.S. Constitution or the state Constitution, it's our true north, and it's an expression of our values. And then following that will be, hopefully, wonderful legislative ideas, exactly like you're talking about. So I would just say I agree with the spirit of what you said. And I think that it is not either or, it is both. And that's how we can really lead to transformation.
Senator Kidmeyer?
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not so confident that a constitutional amendment will have such kinds of results, but because there are other things in our Constitution right now that are being ignored. And so we can see that in the future, I'm not so confident that that is. I'm much more determined on the children of today, children of right now, that are also the children of the future. But thank you, President Kashkari. I appreciate your comments.
President Kashkari, anything else on that one?
I appreciate it. Thank you, Senator.
Well, I do have another question. We have a few more minutes. I do want to turn back to the stimulus, and just in a little research that I've done, the feds have added 4 to 5 times more on the amount of this stimulus versus the financial crisis. And the feds did it in a matter of months, the federal government, of course, versus the credit crisis, which was over years. And now the stimulus is about 10% of our GDP. And the fiscal deficit is at 15.2% of our GDP, which is 4 times greater than following any recent recession recovery. Shouldn't we be very targeted, since we are doing our budget this year? Shouldn't we be very targeted, mindful of how our spending, what we're spending our money on, and the subsequent, the rate of growth just in our state budget?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I mean, of course, it's always smart. We all want to be prudent with taxpayer resources, and we do want to be targeted. But I would just say, from my own experience, in 2008, I was at the U.S. Treasury Department under both Presidents Bush and Obama, and we had a number of housing programs to try to reach homeowners who needed assistance. And we tried to be very targeted because Americans were mad that their neighbor or their brother-in-law bought a house they couldn't afford. And they said, "Don't you dare bail out that guy, he's a bum." So we tried to be very targeted to reach deserving families who just needed a little bit of assistance. You know what happened? We ended up not helping very many people. And it's just the nature of a very complex society that we have, that the more you try to be targeted on the front end, you'll be targeted, but you may end up missing a bunch of people who actually you want to help. And so that's the balancing act. I don't have a perfect solution for you. I would just say, during the pandemic, I view this as a wartime scenario, that the US government has the resources to support the American economy and American families. So we should be aggressive there. But then once we get the pandemic behind us, then absolutely, we need to return to more traditional budgeting, more traditional views on fiscal policy. That would be my humble observation.
Okay. Is Minnesota underperforming or overperforming in a national viewpoint?
Madam Chair, I think it depends. I think it's pretty close to the median. I think in some ways the Minnesota unemployment rate has fallen at the official unemployment rate. But again, that doesn't count people who are no longer looking for work. Different sectors of Minnesota's economy have recovered. I mean, obviously the ag sector is doing very well because ag prices are high again, and there's been a lot of support from the federal government. So I think it's pretty sector specific. I think Minnesota, I haven't seen the latest data, is kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of vaccinating people. The best thing we can do is get this pandemic behind us. And the way we do that is get as many Minnesotans as possible to have been vaccinated, and then we can return to normal. And then we got great competitive strengths. I mean, I'm not betting against Minnesota. We have most sectors of the US economy here. On average, we have a highly educated workforce. We have a lot of strengths going for us. We just got to finish executing against this pandemic. And then I think we'll be very competitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just looked at a graph last night too. I think for your district, Minnesota is behind the Dakotas, but it is a little ahead of Wisconsin. So very interesting. But it is all about the vaccinations, rolling them out. And perhaps Senator Benson has something to comment on that.
Madam Chair, and I was reading some CDC stuff this morning. Are we, and I have to follow up, are we surveying people saying, if you've had COVID in the last 3 months, please consider deferring? And, I support Senator Franzen. I thought we should have done vaccine rollout to elementary school teachers where the kids had been out of school the longest. Those also happen to be the ones with the greatest disparities, and we could have stabilized those environments and given confidence to those educators who are being asked to do incredible things. When Johnson & Johnson comes out, I think it's a very well-suited vaccine for vaccination for those frontline workers, like the grocery store clerks who have been at this since the very beginning, and making sure that if we're going to ask people to do hard things, that they have early access. But until we get that Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I think this 2-dose vaccine needs to be handled in systems where we have appointments and follow-up. And so let's leverage our really strong healthcare systems to make sure that we're getting it to the people who are the most impacted and in the most efficient way possible.
Don't you love how I just kind of throw you out there, Senator Bennett? And you're always back to the occasion.
I expect nothing else, Madam Chair.
President Kashkari, anything to respond to that?
No, I thought that was very insightful. I mean, obviously the senator knows a lot about it, and I was interested in hearing her perspective. So thank you.
Thank you.
So, Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate what Senator Benson said as well, and Franzen, in regards to Senator Franzen, in regards to all of this. It is very important. I just want to put a word in, though. I think the vaccine should be targeted at those who lose their lives the most, and that is our seniors. And especially in Minnesota, we've had a lot of that. So I appreciate all the front line in a variety of kinds of ways, but our seniors have really taken the brunt of this particular disease. It is without question. And then there are those with comorbidities, but we should deal with those getting the vaccine who are the most vulnerable. And I believe in the nursing homes, long-term care, we accomplished that, but I think in the general population, there are still many more that are at that age. So I just wanted to put a little plug in for them while I could. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator.
And Madam Chair?
Yes, Senator Champion.
I'd like to put a plug in for people of color, because when you think in terms of the people who have been most devastated by this pandemic, is people of color. And when you think about the people who are the low-wage workers, who are equally as important in order to make sure that this virus doesn't spread, those are the people who are taking care of those folks who are in the congregate living and also in your long-term care facilities. So you can't look at one segment of the population and not look at the other segment of the population. And I think that's where the challenge happens, is that we look at one segment that we're okay with, but then we fail to see the other segment who needs to be equally as engaged and cared for in order to really make sure that we as a society are protected and that we're doing everything to decrease the rate of infection. So I just wanted to say that because people of color are getting it, both those who are caring for these wonderful folks who are in our long-term care facilities and congregate living. They're also on the front line because they can't work from home. We heard President Kashkari talk about that. So when we think about targeted and intentional strategies, I just want us to have a comprehensive way by which to look at it and not just talk about a favored section of our society.
And Madam Chair, I just want to just a quick reply and say, Senator Champion, I totally agree with you. And that's why the very first group of vaccinations were both the staff and the residents, because you must do both. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Senator Kiffmeyer. On a side note, my best friend is the Assistant Inspector General for HUD, and she is happening to work on this, what is the new workplace kind of term sheet. And she's worked a lot on the COVID rollout also. So when I get a copy of that, I'll let you all know. It should be very interesting what we're facing going forward and how it affects our budgets also. And we all know it is going to affect our budget in different ways, you know. Is there any further questions, any comments? Dr. Kashkari, thank you so much for coming with us again. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I hopefully you walked away with perhaps a different perspective or insightful measures. We certainly did with this conversation. And It's greatly appreciated.
Well, Madam Chair, I appreciate it. This was a wonderful conversation. And I hope all of you will just take away from this that we want to be a resource for you. We are not a partisan institution. We do data and we do research and we do analysis to try to shine a light on the most important economic challenges we face. And if we can help you with data and analysis so that you can make your policy decisions, we would love to do that. And so please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to work with you.
Thank you. I don't know if that's ever happened before, so we really appreciate that from our president of our district. So very, very, very good. Members, we have a Thursday hearing at 8:30, and we're going to be covering the governor's budget with MMB and the commissioner. So with that, this finance committee is adjourned. Thank you very much, all.